Intertextual Cardboard Experience.
Hello and welcome to Intertextual Cardboard Experience, where we're excited to bring to the show our first guest of the year and 31st guest overall, the designer of Much Gravitas, Cole Wehrle. How are you doing today, Cole?
I'm doing very well. Trying to recover from that introduction. I don't think I've ever been described as having gravitas before.
Yeah, well, I sometimes try to do plays on words, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So
It's a stunning blow.
Awesome. But yeah, obviously each episode is a special one. This one is going to be special for different reasons, and that's due to some of the differences in it. We'll talk about board games a bit, but we're going to also move away from board games a little more than the show typically does. And some of the main topics that we're going to weave in today are reading, specifically author Thomas Pynchon and his novel Gravity's Rainbow, and then running. So running, reading, and board games, a nice little trio there. But before we start picking up our legs and moving at a pace a little bit faster and walking, let's stay grounded in one of my typical introductory questions. And that's just kind of having you reflect on a formative memory that made you fall in love with gaming or a recent memory that reinforced that love for you.
Well, I've been gaming for a really long time. I think some people got into contemporary board games. Usually, people who are around my age, I'm 38, started playing contemporary board games like after college. I started playing quite early. I mean, it was elementary school and middle school. I had a friend who's had an uncle who would always send him whatever the new Euro game was. So the year Taj Mahal came out, he got a copy of Taj Mahal. And the year Puerto Rico came out, he got a copy of Puerto Rico. And I was not really ready to tangle with those games when I was that age, but I was aware that games were interesting, that they were interesting to me pretty early on. And I remember there was a moment where I was learning about the old game Diplomacy from the 1950s, and I was really excited to play it. And I bought a copy of Diplomacy with the Hasbro edition with the metal pieces, and I learned the rules and I read essays about it. I was totally prepared, and I invited six of my friends over to play a game of Diplomacy. So excited and thrilled, and they were completely upset, not because we were being traitorous, but because you couldn't put more than two pieces in one zone. And reflexively, I was defending the design. I said, no, 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 no. There's some reason why the game only lets you put one piece in each zone, but I didn't have the language or the experience with games to know why that was important. But what was happening, I think, is I was starting to develop a notion that games are making these abstractions, and the abstractions are powering the games. And the argument that we had over why couldn't there be two boats in the Black Sea, because of course that was the first thing that happened, that Turkey and Russia each had a bounce when they tried to send their fleet into the Black Sea, and the game stopped. We actually didn't get any further in the game because we spent the entire hour, 2 hours that I had hoped to be playing, even the first few turns of Diplomacy, arguing about whether or not you should have two votes in the same sea. And I think that conversation kind of like haunted me all through high school. And I just kept thinking about games and how their rules force us to do things that are against our other instinct. How they really ask you to put on a pair of blinders in order to sculpt the area of play.
Oh, that's a really interesting thing, and like you said, just kind of have that happen a little bit earlier. What, sorry if I missed it. What point in your high school career was this? Was it like
So
early?
I think I was probably in eighth grade or seventh. I mean, again, like it was. I don't know why these games were ending up on my shelves. But it was early enough, and it was also a place where I loved talking and arguing about games even when I was a kid. I mean, I think a lot of kids like talking about games. They have, I mean, certainly my children have lots of opinions about their favorite Minecraft bods. Um, but it was I feel like growing up in an era where it was sort of difficult to play games, like if you didn't have a copy of it or if you didn't have a computer good enough to play a game. I mean, I remember when the first StarCraft came out, I did not have a computer that could play it, but I spent a lot of time like talking about and thinking about StarCraft, drawing little maps, like thinking about like people would describe a mission they were stuck on, and we would like war game it together, and none of us had played StarCraft except the one person in our friend group who happened to have a computer that could play it. And so talking about games was as important as the act of play, like very early on in my childhood.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's like something that kind of thinking back on my time growing up in gaming, like the same time frame was I don't know, that's bringing back memories, but oh, I like that a lot. Neat. Well, cool. I think well we're thinking about games, we're thinking about other things. I like that thought as one that's going to ground us uh, to start though, like I said. But here you get a choice. Like I said, we're going to talk about games. We're going to bring them up in different ways. Would you rather? I'm giving you full control here. Would you rather start with the running topic, or would you rather start with the Pynchon train of questions?
Oh my goodness, what a choice. I mean, it's funny because trying to provide a very natural movement here because um one thing that about the running
Mhm.
that matters is when I was growing up, my parents were both really adamant about play, and they wanted their kids to they wanted us to be playful, not in a way that was like jokey, but in a way that like you should as a human um, know how to build a campfire, know how to play all the usual sports, be familiar with all the various games. You shouldn't rely on leagues. They actually hated organized sports. My dad grew up playing a lot of hockey growing up. He played hockey in college, and I think probably entertained ideas of playing hockey full time. And then it didn't work out for one reason or another. And he kind of made the choice to like move away from that world and left it always, growing up with like a little, not bitterness, but skepticism about organized sports. So like so I grew up in a family that loved sports, but like never watched sports. I couldn't name more than half a dozen teams in any professional sport, maybe. But sports were important. Like I love playing baseball. I love playing softball, hockey. I mean, these are the things that we did growing up, because they were all the same thing. So but I'd go on a run or something growing up a little bit, or I'd play a game of football in the alley, and then in the evening we'd set up and play a board game, and there was a smooth continuum between all those objects. And then I will say, when it comes to reading, it's it's the thing that I probably do the most when I'm not doing any other single activity. Just in terms of hours logged. And it's funny. Because I work in history games, I think people make the very reasonable assumption that my graduate work and my professional life was somehow like oriented around history, and it's not actually. Like my graduate degree is in English. Like I do literary studies. I taught at the University of Texas as a graduate student, for 6 years basically. Um, and at the end of graduate school, they let you kind of teach a class of your choosing. It's a little like it's a very small thank you. And I said, I want to teach a hard novels class where we just read two really hard books. And the books I chose were Moby Dick and Gravity's Rainbow, because they have reputations as being hard books. I didn't want to choose like Gaddis's The Recognition or something that like no one even knows that it's as hard as it's going to be. I wanted a book that would kind of scare someone. Like, oh, I've heard, I could have picked Ulysses or something. Um, and it was my favorite class I've ever taught because it attracted a certain kind of student who you don't sign up for a class like that and then ever find yourself complaining about how difficult it is because you know what you're getting. It is what it is, what it says on the tin, right? Um, so, maybe we should talk about maybe we should talk about books first, and then we can talk about running second. I'm finding myself more pulled into talking about that, although I have so many feelings about running.
Okay. Well,
Um,
like I said, it's they might converge in different spots.
well, yeah,
We'll
they
make it
certainly do.
we'll make it work. So, okay, awesome. That's like some of your, introductory thoughts on your, graduate experience and that class that you taught with Gravity's Rainbow. Uh, I didn't know, and I'm glad glad you answered those questions that I didn't like ask. But that's like a really good transition. So at this point in time, then, how many times have you read Gravity's Rainbow?
Ooh, let me think about that. Because I could probably answer it pretty specifically. Um, I pretended to have read it at the beginning of college. Like I read portions of it and tried to fake my way through most of it, and it was deeply incomprehensible. But I did like kind of like make it through. And then in later college, I did my undergraduate work at Indiana University, where I studied journalism, history, and English. And I I read it a second time when I was a junior, and that time I felt like I actually kind of got it. Like not, it's a hard book to just sort of get, but it was one that like started clicking together. And then I read it a couple times during graduate school. And then I read it right before I taught that class, and then I read it again during that class, very, very slowly, very carefully. I mean, that was the great pleasure of teaching a class that only covers two books, is you can go at a very, very deliberate pace. And then I read it again for a book club after graduate school, and then I read it a second time with almost the same book club. Um, so I don't know, five or six times I'm into it. It's a book that I feel like I know pretty well. In fact, I realized somewhat panickedly this morning that I had forgot to bring it with me. Um, and I was like, I think I'll just be good though. Like I'm pretty familiar with its shape. Um, I I first was introduced to Gravity's Rainbow in I think obliquely in high school. Someone I knew was reading it, and I looked at it and thought like that's intriguing, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. And then when I was in college, the brother of my girlfriend at the time was really into it, and I liked him too. And I thought he was like, he's the same person who like introduced me to David Lynch, right? Everyone's got one of those people in their lives. Um, and so I was like, well, if the coolest person in the world likes this book, then maybe I will also like it. And it just absolutely hit me like a ton of bricks. It blew me, even that first read, which I did not really fully complete, it just knocked my socks off. I couldn't believe how wonderful it was. Um, and I read a few other Pynchon novels in that time, and then every time I have come back to it, I kind of find more in it. And actually, I've come to appreciate like his wider canon quite a bit. I think that he doesn't have a bad novel really, and um, I'm finding myself gravitating towards Mason Dixon, which I think might be my favorite like individual one. But Gravity's Rainbow is by far the one that I'm the most familiar with. And it's also, I think the thing I'll say about it too is it is like Moby Dick. It's a big book and it's like a little hard, but it is so deeply unpretentious. I think it doesn't like it, you can be you it will take you as you are. Like you don't need to understand every little bell and whistle, every little flight of fancy. I certainly don't. To find a lot in that book. Um, and it has a sense of humor about itself and its own project that I think is really important. There's a lot of levity to it. Where sometimes with these like larger, difficult novels, they can be a little self-serious. Um, but I don't think Gravity's Rainbow is like that.
Okay. Well, so I'm going to lay like a little bit of like background here. I've not read the novel five or six times. Actually, I haven't read it once. I think the number of times where I've like started reading this thing has probably been at about three, but I've had the idea of talking to you because on various social media, maybe some like AMAs or, you know, like anywhere where I've seen your words, and it's kind of funny because like the designer diaries or videos or whatever that I've like watched and read from you. There's like so many different thoughts from them that swirl around. But I knew that you were a Pynchon fan. I knew that Gravity's Rainbow was like one of your favorite books. So I'm like, okay, this would be like a fun thing to talk about Gravity's Rainbow, talk about games. And then I think it was on Dan Thoreau's interview, the most recent one that you talked to him, and you talked about running a little bit too, because you mentioned how your kids would, or one of your kids would ask, like, "Oh, is this like a running day or a work day, depending on when you would like leave for the morning?" And I'm like, "Oh, like that's like something interesting to bring in too." So I was like, I was going to PAX. I went to PAX. I'm like, "Hey, if I see you, I'll bring up these ideas." And I told you, I'm like, "Hey, I'll reach out once I'm done with the novel." And you're like, "No, sooner rather than later. Read the first section, read Beyond the Zero, and we'll come back and talk." So here we are for that. Um, but I think that leads into like a pretty good question though too. I I feel like, and this isn't, you know, trying to be boastful or anything, but I've worked through some difficult novels in the past. That's what I
Mhm.
like doing. My background is in English as well. I've only read one other Pynchon novel, and that was Inherent Vice. But this is one that I kind of mentioned that even still now is like a tough one. It's one that I'm struggling with. So I know now that I know that you've read the book about 5 or 6 times, or probably six, because I just asked that. Like, what do you think the most like challenging aspects of the novel are for someone getting into it for a first time, or even retrying a second time, third time? What like sticks out? Where's like the difficulty lie for a read
Mhm.
of Gravity's Rainbow?
It's a great question. So there are a couple things at work. One of them is Gravity's Rainbow is a hard, I'm going to call it like a hard first book. And what I mean by that is sometimes I will talk about the novel like at work and someone's like, "Oh, I really want to read that." And I hate doing this, but I always have to be like a little gatekeeping, be like, "What other things do you read?" Because you don't, if you haven't read a book in a while, this is a really hard one to just pick up because it just demands kind of your 100% attention. This is not a book that can be like I will sometimes I do love audiobooks, and actually the Pynchon audiobooks are to a title incredible. They have found it's obvious whatever like internal politics exist at the company that owns his titles. I think it might be Random House. I don't know precisely. They have selected the best readers imaginable who have an incredible range of skills, linguistic, dramatic, and they're just amazing readings. But if you go running to one of these books and you stop paying attention for like maybe just a few seconds, you are lost. You need to be able to have a little button on your bone conducting headphones or whatever to like rewind 10 seconds because it is just so easy to kind of like fall off of them. What I usually tell people about Pynchon's books is that the hardest thing about them, I think, is I think that there are two sites of difficulty. Um, and then there's this other problem. So the other problem, which I'll start with, is a lot of people when they read novels are looking for plot. They like to sit like they want to grab the plot or the character, and then they're going to hold on to those things because they understand the story. They think they're understanding what's happening. They understand the book, or if they can sympathize or like relate to a character, that character will pull them through the book. Neither one of those things is going to help you with the Pynchon novel. Now, the weird paradox for people who've like read a lot of Pynchon is plot and character are incredibly important in Pynchon novels. They are like extremely well articulated plot machines. Gravity's Rainbow is a lot more like a 1940s no like spy noir than it is like anything else. But it can take a while to like realize that. And also his characters, I think, are very well rendered. But for new readers, plot and character are not where you want to go. So those are like that's like the big red herring. And then the actual two pieces of difficulty are one, there are a lot of characters, a lot. We are talking like Tolstoy levels of characters. There's going to be 100 or 200 oddballs going around, and it actually is a useful exercise to just like when you see a proper noun, be like, okay, that's a character's name. I'm just going to write that name down, and I'm going to write like the one thing I know about them, just so when they come back later, and they usually do, you can be like, oh yeah, I remember, Waxwing or any number of other people. The other thing is at the sentence level, people can run into a problem. And this happens right at the beginning of Gravity's Rainbow on that first page. Because Pynchon is he's a very powerful stylist. He really I think understands how far you can stretch a sentence without it breaking. And you are going to read some long sentences and some long paragraphs. And what I usually tell people is pay attention to your objects in your subjects and your verbs. Like when you're reading those long sentences, like slow down and try to like attend to what is happening in the sentence because almost always it is grammatically like sound, and when it's not grammatically sound, like form is being played with in an interesting way. Um, and so, it's all the usual piece of advice, which basically all this boils into one central piece of advice, which is if you're reading a Pynchon novel, the best thing you can do is slow down and just like allow yourself to like work through the chapters as like single set pieces. Um, I had a student when I was teaching the class who really liked reading the chapter synopses first. And he told me that he would read the chapter synopses and then he would reread the chapter until he could recognize the chapter synopsis and what he had just read. And it does actually get easier. I mean, one reason why I suggested like getting through the Beyond the Zero book is almost every trick in Pynchon's bag for Gravity's Rainbow is demonstrated in that first book. The first book is almost like a tutorial. Like here, it's like a training camp, and then you read the rest of the novel, and you're going to get a lot of different things are going to happen. But if you could made it through that first book, nothing else in the novel is going to be difficult. It's the same sort of things. The other like little piece of advice I always give people is I think so. Usually, I actually really dislike book clubs usually because there's this fundamental I'm going to call it like the book club character where people tend to be a little judgy when they're in a book club. They're like, "Oh, did you like it? Did I like it? What's your Goodreads score of this book?" And you're always like trying to grade the thing. Um, and you'll find people I don't know, offering like studio notes in the way that like our brains are very broken. We're like, I thought Act Three was underdeveloped. Like, stop! Don't say that. Like, are you a novelist? What are you? It's not. So what I usually tell people when we're talking about Pynchon is, and I think this is actually true of basically any piece of art you engage with, just extend the benefit of the doubt. Just say like, okay, I'm going to start reading one of the world's great novels, and maybe I won't like it, but like there are not like Gravity's Rainbow is not bloated. Like the books that are long, it's going to seem you're going to read a chapter and you'll be like, I don't know what this chapter's doing. That's fine. Like don't get mad and be like this chapter doesn't make any sense, therefore it's chaff or something. And so I always tell people like be generous with Pynchon because he is also being really generous with you. And you want like I think a little bit of generosity goes a long way when you're trying to tackle something that is difficult and is going to like kind of push your brain out in all sorts of weird, unexpected ways.
Wow, that's like fun and funny because a lot of the things that you were saying, kind of especially with it being my first read, did resonate with me. You had the note on kind of like the audiobooks. So let me see if I can kind of like synthesize what you're saying and like bounce my experience off of it. So naturally, I'm a very slow reader. I just kind of always
Sure.
have been. I really need to kind of like hit my focus and find my zone. And I will say that um, honestly, probably pretty recently since we talked and since I've been reading after that point, I kind of have in my opinion, hit like a pretty ideal flow of how I am like digesting, the words on
Mhm.
the page. After we talked, I drove back from Philadelphia, and I listened to probably like 90 of the 110 pages that I had read already. And like you said, that audiobook was really well done, and it did kind of like reinforce some of the things that I had been thinking or reading. And I usually don't do this at all, but I was reading and then I was finding synopses afterwards. So that was kind of like my process. I was reading, finding synopses afterwards, potentially backtracking to see if there's like any incomplete pieces to reread. And then I listened to it. So that definitely helped a lot as well. But I feel like from the structural level, my reading of it is in a pretty good spot. But one of the things that is kind of tripping me up too is, well, first off, read I'm reading the physical novel,
Mhm.
and I feel like I know that some people like reading on Kindles, and I don't know. I just haven't done it. Not that I'm opposed to it in any way whatsoever, but I do feel like it'd be nice to just like click on the words and highlight.
Yes.
That'd be so nice because I hate stopping reading to pull out my phone and look something up. And I know that it's necessary and I do it
Yeah.
if it's like really something that's blocking my understanding like 100%, like if I just can't get past it, I'll stop. But I do also feel the times I don't do that where I am kind of glossing over some things unintentionally, but it's just kind of
There
like the
is
way it is.
I started donating money to Wikipedia when I started my Pynchon book club because I felt like part of the joy of reading the books is just learning about the world. And so usually it'll happen in post convert, we'll do the read, we'll be talking about like, hey, did you know this like weird, institute actually existed? And like here's a weird Wikipedia page, and suddenly we are on what are truly like the most cursed like Wikipedia tunnels, including into things like Nazi like spacesuit designs, which they look like knights, somewhere between like a submariner and a knight, like a scuba suit. Anyway, and of course, there's a whole universe of things down there. I mean, I actually like. So I happen to have a PDF that I just stumbled into of the
Mhm.
novel. Could I read like a tiny bit from it to just to put some of these like problems in focus?
Uh,
Because I
uh,
think yeah, because I think if I clarify things, right?
100%. Go for it.
Okay, so the first chapter starts with the screaming comes across the sky, and then we get what is like a montage. And actually, this is something I didn't mention, but about like one of my best pieces of advice for people reading Pynchon is watch an F.W. Murnau film, like watch Sunrise or watch a Fritz Lang movie. Because when you watch late silent films, they make a lot of use of montage, which is this, it is just what that word means directly. But imagine we don't really do it in modern cinema anymore, but several scenes and images, and it could just be a train on the tracks, just like a close up of the drive wheel, or it might be people dancing, and you kind of, and then this the city lights beaming up into the sky, and all three of these images are happening simultaneously in the frame. This is a like the governing style of Pynchon. He loves montage. So the very beginning of the novel, which is confusing, is a montage. It is in like you're basically watching like a montage of this evacuation. You're not like, who are these characters? What's going on? Et cetera, et cetera. You get to the end of this montage. It's just a few pages of the novel. And uh the narration begins, a paragraph begins, there's no way out, lie in wait, lie still and be quiet. Screaming holds across the sky. When it comes, will it come in darkness or will it bring its own light? Will the light come before or after? And the paragraph ends. Next paragraph. But it is already light. How long has it been light? All this while, light has come, percolating in along with the cold morning air flowing across his nipples. It's begun to reveal an assortment of drunken wastrels, some in uniform, some not, clutching empty or near empty bottles, here draped over a chair, there huddled into a cold fireplace, or sprawled on various divans, unhoovered rugs, and chaste lounges, down the different levels of the enormous room, snoring and wheezing at its many rhythms, in a self-renewing chorus. As London light, winter and elastic light grows between the faces of the mullioned windows, grows among the strata of last night's smoke still hung, fading from the waxed beams of the ceiling. all these horizontal here, these comrades in arms look just as rosy as a bunch of Dutch peasants dreaming of their certain resurrection in the next few minutes. End of paragraph. So, like, that's essentially like two sentences. Um, and the reason why I mention it is we have like a montage and then we have like this extended scene making, which then brings me to like the next trick that Pynchon uses, which is the list. These like kind of like pan shots. It's very cinematic. In fact, I think reading Gravity's Rainbow while watching old movies is really helpful because the book is so cinematic. And like just the notion that like we're going to be slow panning, like here's a character, this montage you just saw, it wasn't just impressionistic. You're in a dream, and then the dreamer wakes up in this sort of, among the wastrels, like in this weird dilapidated London mansion, which is going to come up a lot. And then we have this like pan shot of all the people around, and it's a moment within the first few pages of the book, but I think you get literally the first two big stylistic things are this montage and then this list, which is like this is establishing the kind of like cinematic mode that Pynchon is going to be operating in. And if you think about a lot of other books, there's not really anything like it. I mean, I think what is amazing about a Pynchon novel, especially True Gravity's Rainbow, is you will read something that you have never read before. Just a style of writing a novel that you've never encountered before, and then a page later, it'll happen again. And there's just such a deep roster of like tricks that it can be a little disarming because most novels are quite homogenous, right? You begin reading the novel, it's operating in a certain style or certain framework, and then it is executing the entire piece in that mode. And with Pynchon, there's a lot of modes.
That's good. I yeah, I do recall. I don't what. So I would well, numerically we'll call this like a attempt three for me, and I feel like none of the times where I stopped reading were times where it's like, oh, I'm not like enjoying my time. It was just always one of those time and place things, and I typically will juggle a few things that I'm reading and do pretty well with that. But then every time that I'd come back to this and open it up, I'm like, okay, I'm kind of screwed. But I did remember reading uh cine the movie influences that he tried to bring into the book, or not tried to, that he did bring into the book, and that kind of the scenes themselves were meant to be, kind of literal scenes, and that the I don't know what you would call the kind of the formatting for the chapter, but those boxes, kind
Yeah.
of like that. I don't know,
Yeah,
like
I
the
think I think
film.
they get called like episodes, but there is like it's funny, I've actually never thought of them as like little squares in like a reel of film, but they are kind of like cuts, right? They are like scene. I usually call them episodes, but it doesn't. I mean, the chapters, there's some kind of break. They matter a lot.
Hmm. Yeah. So, okay, I honestly don't even know where where I was going with that thought, but yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And one of the things that you mentioned, I think, in your last kind of chunk of talking too, of like how a character will be introduced and then it will go into montage, and how that like will sync up to the sentence structure as well. It's funny. I think the most analogous experience that I had in reading previously would be with, oh, uh, my brain is breaking. Faulkner and
Sure.
Faulkner's
Yes.
use of parentheticals, where you might be in the middle of a three-page sentence or a two-page parenthetical, and then you pop out and you're like, okay, what was the subject before, and what was that parenthetical
Yes.
describing? It is pretty similar here. And then all of a sudden you jump back to the character who is talking about, but everything else may have been images or explanation
Yeah.
or backstory or whatever it is that's going on. And it is fun piecing that together, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just so. I mean, I can like Gosh, I just want to read the whole book out loud because it does, like the paragraph I just finished. The next sentence is, his name is Captain Jeffrey Pirate Prentice. He's wrapped in a thick blanket, a tartan of orange rust and scarlet. His skull feels made of metal. Character description. That's your first character, right? Underline them, put it in quotes, like put that in your list. And then I won't read it, even though I love the next scene. The next paragraph is like a small action scene that is rendered very plot forward, very direct, but is in that kind of Faulknerian way, like so rooted in perspective. Or like, I mean, almost, I just read a Cormac McCarthy novel, and I just think that like this, what gets called like free and direct discourse, where you're kind of like melding narration with your own thoughts. Pynchon is really good at it, and you will get these action scenes that are so impressionistic, because the camera's inside someone's skull, right? Or whatever. There's actually a lot. His use of perspective is complicated and too complicated for probably this conversation. Well, because
Yeah.
it varies a lot. There's an amazing chapter late in the first book where Jessica is staying with Roger, and she like gets up for like a smoke, and Roger's still asleep, and she just reflects. Or do I have it backwards? Is it Roger who gets up and Jessica's asleep? Ooh, I can't remember. I think Jessica's the one who's up. Um,
I
but
think she's
it, yeah, it sort of like hovers over, through memory and through like the scenes of that evening, and it's incredible, and it can be very disorienting when you're reading it, because nothing was really, unless you're reading very carefully, it's easy to miss the like kind of like scene jumps.
Yeah, and here now I think I found the character too, because like you said, a whole slew of characters. But then, you know, towards the end of book one as well, there's that pointsman chapter two, and talking about point of view, the it's turned to second person. It's you, but
Mhm.
then the you is pointsman, and that's that's an interesting use as well. So I didn't actually have this kind of like on my set of questions, but due to the fact that you did kind of teach us novel, I think that can bring up like a good question. So I've taken a good number of English classes in my scholastic career as well, and I think, different professors will try different things. Having your course being one where you're focusing on two novels, I guess, what kind of two-part question. What were, and this was probably a while ago too, so
Sure. That's
answer how you will. How, how did you want, like, what was your goal and intent in in structuring that class, especially having, half of a semester for it?
yeah.
What were kind of some of the ways that you wanted to work through it? And maybe you could give some context to the number of people in the class as well. And potentially then as a follow-up, like what are some things that you would do now, uh, removed
Mm,
from that experience and with further experience?
interesting. I Let's see. Well, I think what I mostly wanted, a lot of undergraduate uh, classes in English move very quickly through big books or just don't cover big books at all. So basically, I was looking at it. I didn't have like a particular single argument that I wanted to make about Pynchon or about Melville for that matter. But I just looked at course offerings, and I was like, because people want breadth in their, in their courses, either through surveys or through, the rare single, like even a single author study is a little out of fashion. Mostly books are being put together topically, where you're like, oh, we're going to look at enclosure. Here's a bunch of stuff about enclosure. Um, that's the kind of dominant mode for designing classes right now. And I thought, well, the thing that's getting shortchanged in this style is our big books. And I think big books are extremely important. I think it's an amazing expression of the novel form, and some of the best work happens in big books. So what if you build a class that's just going to like look at big books, right? And there are kind of two ways of doing this. One of them is you could build a class where the topic is novels that are very long. And so we're going to read like a Henry Fielding book, and then we're going to read like a Charles Dickens, triple decker or something, and then we'll read Middlemarch. And I thought, well, the problem with that is you're going so quickly, you can't really appreciate what is excellent about a big book, which is that it can take its time with something. And so I wanted to pick two big books that were very packed. And I put Moby Dick and Pynchon together because one is regarded as potentially the greatest American novel of the 19th century, maybe of all time, and the other one, maybe the greatest American novel of the 20th century. And both of them actually have a very similar approach. Sometimes it's called maximalism. And so basically, what does it mean to write a novel with all the characters? What are you trying to capture about the American experience potentially, or maybe just the nature of the form that requires you to make these novels that are incredibly broad? And in Moby Dick, which I could, as much as I'm talking about Pynchon, I could talk about Melville because I love Melville. Moby Dick is a like deeply quote unquote postmodern novel. It experiments with form so much. It's got plays and musical numbers and weird I mean, it's just there's so much. There's stories within stories within stories inside Melville that it's not unlike the kind of I'll call it like intertextual transmedia nature of Gravity's Rainbow, right? Where it's just that book is trying to capture a world in the same way that I think Gravity's Rainbow is also trying to capture a world. And the last thing that connects them is both novels are about trying to understand one thing. In Gravity's Rainbow, it's a rocket, and in Moby Dick, it's a whale. But like they are very engaged with the subject of like knowledge and understanding. I would frankly, if I had to teach that class again, I would teach it with the exact same syllabus that I already built. I wanted to do it again immediately. I think that I would like to do potentially, if I had the option of doing it again, I'd be very tempted to do it as single author studies. So if we did Melville, we'd probably read like Typee, Moby Dick, and like Pierre maybe. Um, and then if I did Pynchon again, I would I really want to do a Pynchon class that just does the um like the California novels. So I do like Inherent Vice, Crying a Lot, um, Vineland, and then maybe Bleeding Edge. And then if I did Gravity's Rainbow again, I would want to do Gravity's Rainbow and Against the Day as a pair. Although really you need Mason Dixon. The problem is the books are so tied together. Like once you so Gravity's Rainbow starts with the screaming coming across the sky. Dixon, the first line is like snowballs have flown their arcs. And it is like the prequel. It's the sequel prequel to Gravity's Rainbow, and it's clear that Pynchon was like, to me, there is one body of like thought that is clearly producing his three giant novels, and they're all like happening at the same time, and they all are deeply connected to each other.
Awesome. Okay, so I have a question, and I don't want it to sound dumb. I mean, it probably is to some degree, but I think it's a push to a little bit of transition point as well. But I guess how would you define the genre of Gravity's Rainbow if you had to, explain the book to somebody while putting a genre on it? What would you say?
I think Gravity's Rainbow is, I mean, it's a thriller. Like this is an insane way of describing this novel, but it's not. It is. I think Gravity's Rainbow is designed as a thriller, and I think it's a period piece. Um, you like there are mysteries in the book, and those mysteries generate tension. And it is also such a novel about the 1940s and to an extent the 1970s. But that's true of any period piece, of course. It's always going to be also about the period of its own creation. Um, but if I'm thinking about it from the perspective of genre, that's the governing that's absolutely the kind of governing genre because there are a few central mysteries that are informing like the hunt of the book. I mean, Slothrop is on an adventure in that novel to figure out basically his own history and his own relationship with the rocket. And the way Dr. Jomph or Yomph is described is every bit as like sinister and wily as like a Dr. Mabuse or like any of these like kind of thriller characters from the 1930s and 40s.
Oh, nice. I
That is less clear in the first part of the book,
okay.
but
I
it becomes more and more clear.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, just kind of with that experience, I like that. I'm gonna I see it, for sure, and yeah, I'm definitely excited to continue. But that question was kind of leading to another one, and I kind of mentioned before that between your designer diaries or interviews or a whole plethora of places where I could be finding your words. Hopefully, you can correct me if I'm wrong too, but obviously this is dipping into games slightly. And if I'm not mistaken, or I for sure am definitely generalizing too much, but for your design of arcs, you mentioned
Mhm.
how it's kind of a response to, the sci-fi genre, and like you read a whole bunch of, novels and tried to create what could be, a sci-fi story within the game, like your version of that.
Mhm.
But again, probably overgeneralizing, definitely overgeneralizing. So then the question then is kind of thinking about, both Pynchon and the genre of Gravity's Rainbow, and like the amount that you read specifically for certain games. How would you say that your reading of Pynchon has seeped into games?
Mhm.
Potentially more, you know, directly than inherently, because obviously, the things that we make are products of all of our experiences, so that's going to like enter into everything you make, like nonetheless. But what are some things that you have maybe like even consciously thought about in regards to reading these particular novels and your design?
I mean, this is a hard thing for me to articulate. It's a good question because someone asked me, I had an old friend ask me like, would you ever try to make like a Pynchonian board game in the sense that you were like adapting some of these ideas to it? And actually, I think a lot of my games are kind of like in that format, just in terms of how they handle happenstance, paranoia, narrative, like tension, like where the tension comes from. And maybe there's slightly zany character. I mean, one of the things that I mean, I'm working on Oath a lot right now, so it's on my mind. But like one of the things about Oath is that it's an interesting strat. I mean, I think about a game's I'm going to call strategic depth. It's a strategic depth, just like how much are you rewarded for thinking about your actions in a design. I think that's really important in game design. I do think that that's very important. Um, but to me, it always should be at the service of something that is more interesting than just optimizing a puzzle. Like if a game is just about solving a puzzle, then it kind of limits it, like what the form can be about. And one of the things that I think about for Oath, and I use Oath as an example, is Oath to me is I wanted to finish that thought. I think that a, having a game be strategically interesting is like writing a piece of prose that has a kind of grammatical or narrative logic. It's like what's demanded by the form. But the question is, what are you doing with that and how far are you stretching it? Right. And so I'm always interested in saying, like, okay, yes, of course, like the game, like Oath, you can have these long strategies, you can be very deliberate. There's all these really interesting system interactions. But the story that it's generating is actually much more interesting than that. And this to me is Pynchon in a similar kind of way that I see Pynchon's writing as adhering to the rigors of let's call it grammar, right? And but at the same time, not being slave to them and trying to find ways of going outside of that. And that I think that you can really see that in display in Oath and Arcs, which are both. I mean, Arcs is in its use of time very cinematic in its like storytelling language, and that but I think that it will never get to where Oath is in terms of just combinatorial possibilities. Like Oath is a much more maximalist game. Um, and my history games are actually very indebted to 19th century novels and narrative techniques. So like John Company, someone once described John Company to me as like a really good Charles Dickens board game. And they just got it. Like if the book feels like a Victorian novel, then you are engaging with it correctly. At least for me. I mean, you're engaging with it the way that I want to engage with it. Um, yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't directly answer it. It's Pynchon's writing and his narrative strategies inform. They do two things, right? So I think stylistically, I admire it, and it informs my own like aesthetic sensibility. And then the other thing is, I have just learned a lot from reading these novels. They've changed how I think about history. And because my reading of history informs my board game design, they're also informing my board game design that way. So Pynchon is kind of influencing my work from both the top down and from the bottom up. So it's a big sandwich.
Oh, no, that's perfect. You're like, I don't know if I'm answering this question. Like you did. It's perfect. Actually, and from your answer too, I'm curious as well a little bit. You kind of started your response with bringing up the friend who asked if you had contemplated, designing a Pynchonian type of game or something that, emulated one of the novels to a degree. Do you have, in your experience of gaming, and not your games because you answered really well how that reading has influenced your design from both ways. I guess even video games, so board or video games, has there been anything in your experience that you've played that you feel hits some similar notes?
Hmm. There are video games that do. I mean, I actually think that Disco Elysium's writing gets praised a lot, and I'm reading Inherent Vice again right now because I love that. I just love that novel. And I was thinking about like Doc Sportello's narration actually kind of reminds me of the internal monologue, just like the way that you're getting this like kind of, and it's because they're both sort of hard boiled. I don't think it's because Disco Elysium people are like, oh yes, we really want to like adapt Doc Sportello. What's happening is I think they're both looking at the lineage of I'll call it like the stoner noir and then riffing on it. Um, but I do think that like that game has kind of like captured that energy pretty well. Um, in the board game world, I would have to. I don't know if anything is really hit me. I mean, one of the things that's so disappointing about board games is that I find them to be, in terms of their thematics and narrative work, like just extremely homogenous. And there are exceptions to this. I'll play like a Ross Kalman game, like something more in the RPG space, like City of Winter, and I'll think, oh, this is actually doing some really interesting narrative work. But I don't. City of Winter is like The Emigrants. It doesn't feel anything like a Pynchon novel. Um, and so I see little glimpses of other ways of like, for example, I read Wild Sea and played it a little bit this
Hmm.
year, which is a role playing game, and it reminded me of like the Chums of Chance and like the like early 20th century adventure novel, in its kind of like storytelling mode. And of course, elements like that are brought into Pynchon. But one of the struggles with this is part of what makes Pynchon work is the tremendous like range of storytelling styles. And in a board game, you often just have to pick one or two, and you kind of like don't get to have a range. Um,
Huh. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I guess, just coming up with these thoughts for the interview and us thinking about it. I mean, I asked a question. There wasn't really anything that I had in mind where I'm like, yeah, that hits for me for my limited experience, but I was just curious what you thought, and that makes a lot of sense overall. And just kind of one quick note too. I mean, you mentioned Inherent Vice, so this was my previous experience with Pynchon, and I rarely do this, where I saw, gosh, my brain is completely on fried mode right now, but I saw the Paul Thomas Anderson film
mhm.
first, and I am like, oh, I've heard of Thomas Pynchon. I've read other, novels in the similar sphere. I'm like, okay, I'll pick this one up. And I don't typically do that because I just get the images of the characters from like a
Sure.
film superimposed. But with I think uh, the power of the writing was maybe 50, 100 pages in, my entire framework had just shifted. Like all that was like sloughed off, and I was able to like create like a different world with the story in my head. And I don't know, I really enjoyed reading that one. So,
That movie is so interesting because I will see I love PTA's filmography because when people rank it, they rank it so differently.
mhm.
Um, and Inherent Vice to me is like the secret handshake of PTA movies because it is so exceptionally good. But you have to sit with it a little bit longer than the other ones. I mean, even like I love the novel. I had read the novel first, and I watched the movie and I was like, I don't know if this movie works. And then a year later, I like watch it again, and then I watch it again. And suddenly, it's like a movie I'm watching about every year, or about every 6 months, and I'm like, yeah, it is exceptional once you try to figure out the grounds on which it wants to be like viewed. I mean, and this kind of goes back to what I said about like trying to approach these like hard or interesting pieces of art. Like they have a land, they have a ground that they want to be approached on. To me, the best thing you can do for any artist, and I'm very grateful that my games have been received in this way, is you can approach a work of art on the terms on which it wants to be approached. Um, and that to me is something that like is easy to forget in our own like age, where like just the way our media gets like arranged in feeds, where like the more something is like feedetic. I don't know if there's a term for that, but like suited to being clipped up and put in small bits and kind of scrolled through and engaged with while someone is doing something else. Um, the more that happens, the less generous we get with our readings. And I think it's just really important to be like, no, like you're about to listen to a complex piece of like contemporary classical music. Don't be mad at it for not being a pop album. It actually wants you to engage with it really, really differently. Um,
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, 'cause I think obviously, I mean, you said kind of like the feed edit or the viral nature or the clipped up things, the way that media is dispersed and consumed this like these days, and this isn't just like, you know, being angry at the present and,
no,
or
it's
anything,
just
but it's just like the way it is. And it is different, and the types of things that people consume are significantly shorter on the whole. And like you said, just kind of thinking about some of that long form stuff or whatever it is, and meeting it where it went. I don't know.
mhm.
I like
Yeah, it's just a different. Yeah, it's just a funny. Yeah. I always want to be careful because I don't like. People always think the present's horrible and the past is great, right? It's like it's such an easy line of critique, which I don't think is true,
Mhm.
but I do think it's also important to recognize that like the present is present. It is like shaping how we consume and think about media, and that is different from how we might have done it in the past, and then that determines the sort of things that get created.
Yeah, 100%. I I really like that thought, and we could hop on those. We could keep talking about, you know, we're taking a 180
Yeah,
before
let's take a clean 180. That's fine.
clean 180. Well, this is nice. We've dived into the heady stuff, and my brain always gets broken when I ask questions, and I always just try to like think about, the words of, you know, who I'm talking to and what they're saying, and just like listen to it through. And I don't know, it definitely scrambles me up, but that's why I like doing this. So we're doing the 180. We'll jog. This is our cool down.
Yes.
We're running now. We get to jog on out, but we'll do a few questions lighter, I think,
Well,
about
we'll see.
running, and then we'll bring it. Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see. You
We'll-
don't know my history with running, so
oh, okay. Well, um I think the first question I have here is good, and it's funny because I put this in quotes, and I don't put most of my questions in quotes, and that's because I don't know. I was a teacher for a while, eight-ish years or so. Oh, and I think in the teaching profession or certain professions, you're asked to come up with your why. Like, why is it? Because, a lot of times the other things that make you not want to be doing what you're doing are pushing
Yep.
against. So you got to get asked is like, well, why are you here? And so that idea of like, you know, what does teaching mean to you, or what does this job mean to you, or what is your why, can have those connotations. But I think when it comes to something that's more of a choice or a hobby, something that you
Hmm.
willingly and actively engage with for non-professional reasons, I think it takes on a different form. So that's the question, though. I coach cross country. I've done that for 6 or 7 years now, and I love running. I love everything about it. And one of the things that I want to non 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 in this way, but like actually have the kids start to think about is, like kind of what is their why too? Like what can running mean to them? So it's not just a high school sport, but like what could it mean for them and their future and shaping them and all that.
Hmm.
So the question for you then is like what does running mean to you, or what is your why for running?
Well, I started with a really I had a very direct answer when people would ask me why I would run. I had a very direct answer for a long time, and then what happened is the longer I ran, the more answers I had. It kind of crept up on me. So I having becoming a parent was hard. It hard in ways that I knew were going to happen and hard in ways that I didn't know was going to happen. And graduate school was difficult. And I found myself at the end of graduate school getting ready to like launch my career such that it was like in pretty bad health, like just out of shape, just like I was not taking care of myself or thinking about myself as a body that existed in physical space. I was a list of obligations and kind of nothing more. And then when I moved to Minnesota to start working at Leader, I replaced one big stressor with another, which was, helping this small company succeed and working on Root and doing these absolutely long, crazy days. And then at the end of Root, we worked on the Root expansion. I worked on Vast, the Mysterious Manor, and then went into Oath, and basically had like a 4-year period of completely irresponsible work, like just absolutely there is no free minute of the day. Every ounce of my being is going to be poured into this stuff. And my our third child was born, my daughter Nell, and we, I was finishing Oath while she was in her first year of life, and then Oath was done, and suddenly everything seemed fine. Like Root had done really well, the company was hiring. I owned a house. I bought a house. It was crazy. I mean, my children were all healthy and happy. And I was dropping off someone at the airport and driving home and had like what I can only describe as like a panic attack where I just thought I thought like I was having a heart attack or something. It was crazy. I was just driving around being like, I was so convinced I was done for. And I went to the fire station, bottom of the hill on West 7th for people who know St. Paul. And I went in there and they were like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "I think I'm having a heart attack." And they were like, "Well, you're talking to us, so you're probably not having a heart attack." Um, and I was totally rattled. I was completely rattled. I had never been anxious before in my life. I've never really felt a lot of anxiety. I've never, I like talking to large groups, but something felt like pretty busted in me. I just couldn't, and it just got worse. I felt like I just there were all these like very basic tasks from like just going up a pair of stairs to like eating a meal that would just make me outrageously anxious. And I learned something. So basically, I had a neighbor who was a doctor, and I said like, if I feel like I'm having a heart attack, if I just I like feel like I just want to run, and I don't know anything about running, or I'd run a little bit growing up, but not seriously. And I was like, is that reasonable? If it's like, is this a good way of getting around an anxiety trap? And he's a really nice guy. He's about my age. And he was like, well, if you're having a serious medical episode, your body's not going to let you do that. So if you just want to like play chicken with your body and you're like, oh yeah, you think I'm having a heart attack? Well, what if I run right now? Then what are you going to do? He said it might be a reasonable way of like of sorting through this. And so the next time it happened, I ran around my block and I didn't die. I was heaving, it was fine. And then the next time it happened a couple days later, I went on another run, and then I thought, you know what? Every other day, I'm going on a run, and it is just going to remind me, like to me, running is it is this like it's like breathing, right? It's something that we should be able to do and of course like it's outrageously ableist and all that stuff, but I'm just as a human moving from one point to another at a speed that is more than just like an amble or something. That's just something that we should be able to do. So I'm just going to try to run every other day. And I was running on a pair of tennis shoes I had probably bought in like 2006 that like completely wrecked my poor ankles because they were just like rocks that I was running on. um and then I like bought a pair of running shoes, and it's always my best piece of advice I always tell people when they start running is like force yourself to buy a pair of running shoes because they always cost like $120, and that investment will make you feel guilty about buying them, and that guilt you can use to power through that hard first month. um, but I started doing it, and pretty soon over the course of the year, I had done all this work. I had been to all these doctors. I had cameras put in every little corner of me to try to figure out like what I thought was wrong. But once I started running, all that stuff just kind of like melted away. And it didn't happen right away. It was very slow. It took a year for just by the end of that year, I'm like, my every other week run is like, I don't know, a 5K or something. So like, and not my every other day run. So I'm like, I'm doing 30 minutes of running every other day by the end of that first year. And I just sort of noticed that like, well, yeah, I'm like still a little anxious, but I'm able to operate. I'm able to like I feel like much more like myself. And then I was like, well, I'm just going to kind of keep this up because this is more effective than any sort of thing that they were prescribing me. Um, and the runs started getting a little longer. And I started finding myself realizing that I was spending a lot more time outside, and I run usually in the morning. And I was actually like, I realized that like I just hadn't seen a lot of sunrises, and I saw almost every sunrise that year I was running. I mean, or every other sunrise. And then I was running at different times of the day, and I was like feeling just like the turn of the seasons differently. Like, running by the same tree for a few weeks at a time is really remarkable because you just get situated in your place so much more deeply. And I was living in a really lovely neighborhood in St. Paul called Matt Groveland. And my runs, I would kind of go through the cardinal direction where I'd be rotating. Like, here's my northern route, here's my western, here's my eastern, my southern, whatever. Um, and I just started feeling so much more like in a place. And the thing I learned about myself was that like I I needed something to hold on to that was like work, even when I wasn't work. And running kind of provided me that like this is the core thing. You can always hold on to this. Um, and of course, and then this is where the answer gets complicated because now having been running for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. So Oath came out in 21. So I guess 3 years, maybe four. I've been running. Well, I mean, this is easy because I can go one, two. I'm on my like fourth pair of running shoes right now, right? And I'm not yet throwing them away. I just have them like in the garage, just hanging up, because they'll last about a year, at least for me. And yeah, I'm in my fourth year of running, and there's a million things I love about it. Whenever I travel for work, I never break my running schedule if I can avoid it. It's every other day, always. If I'm sick, I'll skip a day, whatever. But like, even if I'm mildly sick, I'm still going to make an effort. And when I travel for work, my running stuff is in my bag, and it's actually one of my favorite things to do I'm in Philadelphia. I'm going to go on a run. I'm going to run up the steps of the art museum and do the little Rocky thing at the top, right? That's fun. And then I'm in Germany. I'm going to go run through the streets of a European town. Or like there's when we were in San Diego, I was like, oh, we can go run like in Torrey Pines or whatever. Like there were I'm it allows me to see so much more of the places I'm visiting. So it's not just airport, hotel, museum. You're actually like getting a sense of the world. So I love that. I love the time it gives me to think. Either because I'll run with podcasts sometimes or novels or music, or sometimes if I'm stuck on a design problem, I will run with nothing and just force myself to kind of like be in that meditative frame. My oldest son is old enough that he will bike along with me on long runs, and probably this year I'm going to get him a pair of running shoes if he wants to start running with me because he's old enough. Um, and so whenever I see my family, I've all of them run, and I think I accidentally got them into it, which is weird because my youngest brother ran cross country and was a big runner in high school. But as a grown up, I just kind of like we'd all meet for a family affair, and I'd say, "Well, I'm going to go on a run if anyone wants to come." And gradually, more and more people started saying, "Like, oh no, I want to go." And so it has become like a thing that I do with my extended family. And it's just become a really important part of my life. And so it started simply as like a way of sorting through tension and stress and anxiety and has become like a sort of like foundation for how I just like live and breathe. It's hard to imagine ever stopping running. And it never feels like a chore. I'm always so happy when it's time for a run. I had a late day at work yesterday and got home at 6:30, and it's pretty cold here. And I was like, well, even before I sit down and like eat dinner or anything, I'm gonna like strap on my little headlamp and go on a run while it's still above 0 degrees. Because I mean, you're in Western Wisconsin, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, I oh my goodness. I love like everything about that response and and yeah, I there's basically anything I could say in response to that would like unintentionally just like undermine like how beautiful that was. I don't know. I really liked listening to that and yeah, I think uh just kind of like the shortest personal anecdote to respond is that yeah, like for me I've been running relatively consistently for about 15 years now and as kind of like personal like stressors and things that pop up in life, as you get older and anxieties and everything like that, I've made even more of a concerted effort the past couple of years, specifically last year, to be even more like strict with my running, more consistent, more thinking about how all my actions in life would potentially negatively affect my running. And with kind of like an increase in mileage and time that I was out on the road, especially in winter, where I've realized that like kind of my gait and my form was hurting my knee, like I wasn't running right, and I hurt my knee, and that knocked me out for like 3 weeks in February of last year,
Hmm.
and not not like a medically sound choice, but I would go out every single day and be like, okay, this is the day where I think I can run. I would do my little warm-ups. I would do my hip swings, yada yada. I would run 10 yards and my knee would like brick up.
Yeah.
And I would do that over and over. And then I could actually bike okay. It didn't feel great, so I was still getting like a little bit of activity, but I was so knocked out of my schedule, especially like this newer, most deliberate version of the schedule that I had with running for myself. And I don't know, it really messed with me. And
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was 3 weeks. It wasn't like the end of the world. But
No, I every year I have not that's not true every year, but the first couple of years I hurt my ankle a little bit like each year, and had to like really kind of start over, and in terms of my pace and go back down to like, hey, cut it to a half run or to a quarter run. And I was always so anxious, not anxious. That's not the right word to use in context. I was always so excited to get back to the full runs because there's nothing. I mean, when you go out on like a really long one, and it's just a clean run, if it's an incredible feeling, and it isn't. It's not. I think people talk about like the runner's high, and I was expecting more of like an endorphin rush, and it's never that. At least I never get that. I always feel like I just come back just really calm. Like it is, like it's just an absolute like calming effect on me. I one of my other favorite things I love about running is running with new people. And I actually don't know. I am a solo runner. There are really great running clubs in the cities. I wish I were more tied into them. But I do almost all my running just totally by myself. But I didn't really grow up running. And so when I started running, when I would run with someone, um, it they would be stretching. And I'm like, I've never seen that stretch before. And they're like, oh yeah, it's like really good at these things. And so like the folk ways of running, the way that like information gets shared among runners is like one of my favorite things because there's just an amazing culture around it that is so open. And I think I always felt very self-conscious when I was first starting to run about running with people who were more experienced or just more in shape than I was. And at, now that I sometimes get to be in that role with someone I'm introducing, I realize that like it is such a pleasure to be like, no, I would love to go running with you. And like, I don't care if you run an 11 or 12-minute mile and we're only going to go 2 miles or 1 mile because I'll run home or whatever. Like I'll get my own rest of my workout in. That's my issue. But I do want to like run with you at whatever pace you want to run. And then we'll stretch together and we can talk about it and then we can kind of go our separate ways. And it's not like preachy. It's just I'm excited to like show them. It was funny this morning. Someone on staff has started running, and they were like, "Hey, like I'm finding my calves are like breaking up, like 1 mile in or 2 miles in." And I'm like, "Oh, what are you like? Are you stretching before?" And they're like, "Not really." And I'm like, "I didn't even know you were supposed to stretch before running. I always thought you stretched after because that's how we did it in elementary school gym class." And so here I am at work, like we're like practicing calf stretches or whatever. Um, and it's not like I actually like truly despise workout culture. Like I don't, I'm gonna take a like risky, like I'm gonna make a risky statement. And I say that consciously as someone who tries to run like 10 to 15 miles a week and has been doing that for years. Um, I don't like the vibes of CrossFit and like the world of like lifters. I just don't like. I just don't. To me, there is something at the very core level where I'm like, I do not like that in the same way that this is fully personal. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just a vibe. It's just a vibe. But there's this other like more hobbyist. I mean, to me, runners feel like when you talk to people about meditation, like where they like people kind of want to like it's not coming from a place of pride and like some runners are like high optimizers and I totally get that. And especially I used to cycle a lot, and the people who get really into like deep cycling, more power to them. I don't really care personally. I like running slow. I mean, I think I have found my own pace improve without me really consciously trying to do it. Like I'm at like I do like a 9-minute mile, which is not very fast. But every year it kind of creeps down like another 15 seconds. And I'm not really trying to do it. It's just kind of what's happening. Um, but I find that like even the runners who are like really trying to get their half marathon to a seven pace, I'm like, cool, great. But also they're not like telling me this is the only way to run. Um, and so I don't know. I think that there is it's actually why I have a very, and this is, talking about, so I'm gonna keep talking. I actually don't know what to think of marathons as a thing. So PAX Unplugged next year is during the Philadelphia Marathon, and a few people have asked me if I wanted to join them in like running a half marathon, and I trained for a 10 mile. I've run 10 miles a few times, and I trained for a 10-mile race, the Medtronic in the Twin Cities, and the race got canceled because of heat and I was kind of disappointed. And so I ended up just running it anyway because it wasn't actually that hot. And it was like clear that like they was canceled mostly for the marathon because it was going to get hot later in the day. So I found myself jogging downtown, then running this race with the few other people who had decided to just kind of run it anyway. And what I realized was like that was fun, but I actually didn't really care about the race. Um, and I also think that like I haven't got to a point in my own running where I like running for more than an hour, mostly because I don't want to hurt myself. And so I have this like there's this weird thing where like as you get into more of the performance side, it becomes less sustainable. And like I want to be able to run for my entire life. And that means I think going a little more slowly and not pushing. Like I'm not going to try to like do a best mile. I don't, it doesn't mean anything to me. Um, but I think opinions differ. If you want to optimize that, that's great.
Yeah, that's I like that response a lot. I think personally, yeah, in terms of like marathon, I think it's on my list just because I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, you do it and you can not even like say you did it, but you know you did it. But at the same time, when you're talking about the longevity of you as a runner, for me, just kind of when I've increased mileage for like a half, I've done a few halves and things like that. It definitely takes its toll. I don't know if my body would do really well at like marathon training, so that's kind of why I'm hesitant
Yeah.
to try it. And but yeah, I like to throw in races here and there, but I mean on the whole, I run and similar thing, the more you run, the more your times are going to drop. A lot of times I'll just like check in on pace to make sure that I'm not going too quickly. So if I'm going out
Yes.
on like a
Yes.
5 or 6 mile, I'm like, oop, that was too fast.
Yeah.
Just so I don't burn myself out. But yeah, I don't know. Just kind of doing different explorations with running. I started getting into I did a pretty good month of trail running in October in the Ice Age Trail here, and that was just gorgeous. I mean that was another like great shift in my running. It was something that I hadn't done much of. The amount of elevation and scenery and everything that I was introducing was just yeah, I just want to do more of that type of stuff than anything, exploring
Mhm.
and
Yeah. The,
meditating.
Well, it's funny that there's I don't think I've ever really told this story on a podcast, but I like it. I always run during shows, right? So if I'm and this forces me not to stay out too late and like to be very like, look, this is my job. I'm not in a party mode or anything. I want to do this in the long term. So Gen Con, I get up at 6 or 7 in the morning and I go on a run. And there was one year I was at Gen Con a few years ago where I I found myself on, I was like running along the river and there were all these people in there were people like handing out water bottles, like dressed up like goblins. And I was like, what is this thing? And I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna follow this group. And then I accidentally find myself like bootlegging the orc stomp. I get to the end and they're like, you just ran the orc stomp. And I thought, I've run the orc stomp. And they're like, here is a t-shirt. And I'm like, great, I've got a t-shirt now. I've run the orc stomp. And it was amazing. And now I'm like, I run that race every year. I love it. And because it was just in the way that running will introduce you to these like little parts that you had never seen, that you didn't know existed. One of my favorites, just kind of connecting it back to books, one of my favorite reads from the past couple of years is this book by Kim Stanley Robinson called The High Sierra, which is sort of a memoir about spending a lot of times in the Sierra Nevada mountain range and just thinking about hiking and art and like the importance of being out in the world and the importance of like the body and the creation of things. And I just love this book. I had never seen like a really good, I don't know, I think it hit me the way Walden must have hit some people when it came out, where it was such an amazing, like, here's a novelist who writes hard sci-fi, who's like deeply interested in technology and society. But for this novel, he's going to talk about how actually the critical thing is just walking alone or in small groups up in the High Sierra. It's fine. The reason I say that sort of memoir is because it is also filled with like, hey, here's like the shoes that I like to wear, and here's like how I like structure my camp, and like here's how we like build. So he's trying to like explain the actual mechanics of how the hobby works in a way that reminds me of running, which is like I love getting people into running because at some core level, like I don't care. Everyone's hobbies are their own, right? But if you're interested in it, I'm like very happy to be like, hey, yeah, let's go on a run together. I'm like happy to just kind of show. I guess this is the joy of proselytization, right? But I'm like weirdly like more happy to introduce people to the joy. Like I don't. So here's a fun. I mean, this is a board game podcast after all. I don't actually make any attempt to introduce people to board games. Like I think there was a time in my life where I was like evangelizing the hobby, and I had like I made sure to have the correct number of gateway games and all of that stuff in my closet. I'm just not interested. Like I think that's a fine thing to do, but I will try to introduce people to running. Like that I will do.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I that's it is interesting, and one of the things I think for the sake of your time too, and potentially for the sake of some time in the future in the years where I finish Gravity's Rainbow and perhaps other Pynchon novels as well, and we continue our running journeys. There are a lot of things that I have been thinking about for this podcast, and kind of like the overlaps in the ways that you approach, well, board games as not just a hobby but a profession, but reading and running, and some of the similarities and the overlaps, and like do you like doing them more like on your own with people, like those things have kind of been swirling around in my head, and you definitely hit on a lot of those thoughts and questions in your responses too. But I don't know. I guess the short of that is I'm going to hold on to that thought for the future. And I'll just kind of get to the wrap up questions that I typically have for this podcast. And the first one is always just a text of choice, something that's been on your mind in any capacity,
Mm.
whether you're loving it, something you're playing, reading, watching, or listening to, that's kind of something that you want to shout out.
Oh my gosh. It's so hard. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna do one that is thematically appropriate because I could be recommending a lot of books right now. Um, Above this screen, which I'm gesturing to, I know this is audio format. Above my screen are two bookshelves. And the lower bookshelf has things that I like reference a lot, and I'm gonna pull down a book that I read all the time and I love, which is Starting Points. This is Hayao Miyazaki interview excerpts. Basically, Miyazaki doesn't seem like the kind of person who's interested in writing a book. And what the editor did here is they collected basically everything, every interview he had ever done in the early part of his career in one volume. And I love this book. Whenever I am stuck on anything, I love to just like pick like literally a random page and just read him talk about like Japanese commercials or him argue about why a movie that people like is actually bad or talk about the creative process. Um, and it's been on my mind a lot lately. Whenever I'm working on a big project, this is just a book I always come to. So this is something very much on my mind and above my head always. So if ever you see me in an interview, know that I am probably looking at the spine of that book. Um,
I love that. I have never heard of that, so well, basically anything that you've mentioned, I've typed into my document as an ever expanding to check out list. But I also like the just having a nice little visual cue in an audio podcast too, because then I mean it kind of, well, not like reading, but you imagine in it. People can see you sitting at your desk grabbing the book,
yeah.
pulling it down for you. Uh,
There's a funny I like I love I just love how people have different work areas. In my office, there's a maybe 12 or 13 of us in the studio, and everyone's office is so different. And my office is like, how many books can I reach from where I'm sitting? It's like optimized from that. How many books and games can I reach?
Uh, I I like that a lot. That was fun. Oh, speaking of work, well, here this is not a question I'm going to ask. It was something I didn't even write down, but it's kind of funny. It was something that I was thinking about with Gravity's Rainbow a little bit in my line of questioning for that. But obviously you are working at Leader, and for that you're doing a lot of work on Oath right now. Arcs came out in
Mhm.
2024, was a huge hit, huge success. If you want another award, it gets the Intertextual Cardboard Experience Best Game of 2024 that I've only played one time. Very
Very
specific.
good.
Yep, very specific award. You
I'll
can just
take
add
it.
that. You
I'll
can just
take it.
add that to the list. I love it. Just had the group to play with one time. But with Wehrlegig games, Molly House, I don't really read updates that much, but I know that
Sure.
that's like wrapping
It's
up.
coming soon. It's
It's
coming
coming
soon.
soon.
Yeah, should be shipping to backers within the next few months.
Awesome. So those are a couple of big ones, and I guess my question, which I'm not gonna, well, it's a hypothetical question, is between leader, whirligig, family, running, reading. I was gonna ask like what sort of Pynchonian supernatural character skills were you like tapping into to create more time in the 24 hours?
It really like I think it's about the things that I don't do. And I don't like I always hate when people talk about the things they don't do because it's hard to not sound preachy because you're talking about something that you've chosen not to do. But I don't really watch television at all. And I will say, um, I don't have as many casual friendships as I used to have. I have many, many friends. I adore these people, but I'm like the friend who's not often around. So like, my core friend group is gathering and playing, games of Dota or whatever every evening. And I'll see them once a week or something like that. And then mostly it's just about, being really disciplined with my time. Like a lot of people, I've had people around my own age who I was very close to pass away unexpectedly. And the first time that happened to me, it focused me in a way that has still not like loosened. And so if I have a little bit of time, I'm going to use it for something. Um, and I mean, I'm very busy, but I love everything that I do. Like when I get home from work and I get to play with my kids for a couple hours before bedtime, like I am as happy as can be. And then when they go to bed, if I go on a run, I'm happy. I mean, to me, I'm quite content to have myself fully applied. And I think that, the one thing I do get preachy about is I just think it's easy to use time in a way that isn't purposeful. And that might even be okay. I think people have different tolerances. Like you don't need to, direct your whole life with purpose. But I find that it makes me really anxious. So like if I find myself like in a weird spot where I just scroll on Blue Sky for 2 hours somehow, this is why I'm not allowed to be on TikTok because TikTok, I would lose my mind. I just feel like I ate like a giant bowl of junk food whenever I consume it. And maybe I'm very happy to be eating that bowl at the moment, but I just cut all that stuff out. And then the time that's left is there are things that I want to do with it. But I don't know. I also am the kind of person who happily works 60 or 70 hours a week. And that's the kind of thing you can't do forever, but I'm happy to be able to do it right now. It's a great privilege, right, to do this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's definitely like a really insightful, beautiful sentiment, and yeah. So speaking of work though, just kind of final
Yeah,
thing. I know that a lot of people are in tune and checking out what you're doing, and I mentioned a couple of those bigger projects in the Oath expansion and Molly House. Anything else that you kind of want to shout out for
sure.
people to check out in the near future?
So, in the near future for Whirligig this spring, we will be crowdfunding a game called The Hellraisers of Kanawha County, which is about the lead up to the mine wars in West Virginia in the early part of the 20th century. It's designed by Luke Evanson and Matilda Simonson. It is an amazing, interesting kind of PAX adjacent title that I really like, being developed by my brother Drew and Joe Schmidt, who's worked on a bunch of GMT games. It's really cool. And it is also giving me time to work on Infamous Traffic. So I hope it does really well because I'm enjoying working on Infamous Traffic right now, and I want to be able to keep doing it and not rush anything. And then at Leader, I'm working on the Oath expansion. It's huge. If you are a backer, the sort of backer who doesn't read updates, look at the last update, which has a link to the Christmas kit. And inside the Christmas kit, I rewrote the rules kind of as an extended designer diary. I haven't like properly shared them outside of the backer kit, but it's a long rule book that is kind of like it's very conversational in style, and it like ruminates on the nature of the expansion while I'm writing about it. I'm very happy with that document. Um, and so if you want to know what I've been up to, like the last year has been the year of Oath. We have about 6 months left in the development. So hopefully by June it'll be done. And then I don't know what I'm going to work on next. I have uh there is an ARCS expansion that will happen at some point. I have not begun it properly. I'll have a lot more to say about that later this year. And then there's some other projects that I've neglected that I might hop into. But that's what I'm up to right now.
That's perfect. And kind of in a similar, style, like thinking about, time, intention, stories, journeys, and everything like that. I couldn't be more grateful that you took a large chunk of time to discuss all those things. I don't know. I loved it, and yeah, I hope to be able to be in contact in the future, and maybe, like I said, somewhere down the line, somewhere along this journey, read a couple more books and see if we can link up again. I think I
Yeah,
really like that.
that sounds great. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Ryan. It is lovely to talk adjacent to board games for a little bit.
Yeah, it was very adjacent. We didn't talk about games too much at all, so
No, that's good.
interesting. Perfect. Well, thank you.
All right, take care.
Intertextual Cardboard Experience, the most gravitational podcast about board games and any other text that they connect to. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time here. Any further support, such as sharing the show with friends, following the page's socials in the episode description, writing a review, filling out the feedback form, or doing anything else you can think of is greatly appreciated. Keep playing, watching, reading, listening, experiencing.